Today I'm going to build this Japanese-inspired bench where I carve a crack and hand inlay some bow ties. I also get into 3 or 4 different types of joinery. So let's get started. I started out cutting the boards for the top of the bench to their approximate length. Even though the InDesign idea will have bow ties joining a crack, I decided to use standard 8/4 cherry opposed to a slab, mainly because it's much cheaper, and I don't always find a slab with a crack in just the right place to fit my design vision. So after I built the pieces for the top, I took a few minutes to decide which edges to put together to hide the glue line so the grain blends together the best. Once I found a combination I liked, I put the 2 boards together and used some tracing paper so I could see through to the grain and started planning out where the crack was going to be. I tried following the grain the best I could so it would look as natural as possible. I did several variations, tracing different parts of the grain until I finally settled on one that I liked. I also tried to pay attention to the direction of the end grain and used it to determine which direction the crack would go vertically through the wood. Then I used some carbon paper to transfer my drawing to the workpiece. Yes, carbon paper still exists. And then so I could better see the line while I'm power carving, I darkened it all up with a Sharpie. Then I went to work with a power carver on my angle grinder, working to the line on the top and then trying to follow that line. I worked my way down to the bottom. Then I used a soft pad on my random orbit sander to smooth out the grinding marks. Now on the other side I started at the bottom, removing the bulk of the material and feathered it up to the top until I met my layout line. Once I was happy with the shape, I moved on to a little faux finishing to make the crack stand out and look weathered, like it had been there a while. I used a dark brown dye stain and coated the crack. Since it was water-based, I was able to spritz it with some water while I buffed off the excess to create a nice weathered look. Time is money, so I sped up the drying time with a heat gun. Once it was dry, I sealed in the brown dye with some shellac so people that sit on the bench won't get any brown stain from the crack on their clothes. The shellac was a little too shiny, so I knocked down the sheen with some steel wool. Once I was happy with the look of the crack, I mortised the edges of the boards for floating tenons to help with alignment during glue up. Now it was time to move on to inlaying the bow ties. I used some paper to cut out a few different sizes and shapes and started laying them out until I was happy with the look. Then I used some spray adhesive to attach the chosen ones to some scrap walnut and cut them out at the bandsaw. I attached some double stick tape to the bottom of each one so I could stick them down to the bench top, preventing them from moving around while I carefully traced around each one with a razor blade. This transfers their exact shape to the workpiece and gives the tip of my chisel a place to register when I start chopping them out. When I start chopping out the waste, I start about a 1/16 in from the razor blade line, removing a little material before I go right to the line. This prevents the wedge shape of the chisel from compressing the fibers along the razor blade line, which will make the fit of the bow tie look sloppy. As I worked my way down, I did several gentle test fits and made adjustments as I went. I never want to force it until I'm sure I'll get a good fit. If the fit isn't right, I risk not being able to get it back out without damaging something and will be stuck with a bad fit up. Once I was satisfied with the fit, I glued it up and drove it home, then planed off the excess until it was flush. I did have a small area on the bottom where I compressed the fibers with the chisel, so I used a wet rag and some steam to swell the grain back up to a tight fit. Once I had all 3 bow ties inlaid, it was time to move on to milling the legs. To get the thickness I wanted, I laminated some 8/4 lumber together. I took my time matching the grain before glue up to help hide the glue line. And I used my favorite wood glue to glue them up. Now that the glue is dry, I used the chop saw to square off the ends and moved over to the table saw to cut the bridle joints. I used my shop-made sled to help hold the legs square to the blade. Since I'm making the dados almost as deep as the blade will cut, I took several shallow passes so I wouldn't overtax the blade, having the workpiece drift out of alignment. I also flipped the workpiece around and made a second pass each time, keeping the dados centered on the leg. Leg is going to get tapered on all 4 sides, so I took a piece of scrap plywood and made a quick tapering jig for the bandsaw. It mainly consisted of a sled and a few registration blocks glued to it. Then for the opposing side, I saved a cutoff to take up the space where the leg was tapered. I ripped it to a more manageable width and slid it in the jig. To clean up the bandsaw marks, I ran each leg over the joiner. Now to fit the top rail in the bridle joint, I just kept running the board through the planer, taking a little off with each pass until I had a snug fit. Now to cut the curved shape on the upper rails, I made a template and used some double stick tape to attach the pieces to it. I took the bulk of the material off with the bandsaw, then routed one end flush. I then raised the router bit to expose the lower guide bearing and routed the other side. By using a bit with a bearing on top and bottom, I can always route downhill with the grain, avoiding tear out. Moving on to the lower stretcher, I found the center of the leg and marked out for where the lower mortises are going to go. I don't use this mortaring attachment very often, but since I already tapered the legs, it seems like the fastest, most accurate way to cut a few mortises. To get the face of the leg square to the chisel, I used one of the cutoffs to shim it up. Then I went to work chopping out the mortises. I used an air hose to help clear the chips as I worked. And the smoke you're seeing is totally normal when you're using tools that are as dull as this. The mortiser left the walls of the mortise a little rough, so I just used a mallet and chisel to clean them up. To cut the tenons on the stretcher, I used an angle finder to find the angle. Since each leg was cut on the bandsaw and then cleaned up at the joiner, there was about a ½ degree difference between each leg. So I measured and cut each tenon to match its corresponding leg. I first cut the angle on the stretchers and then adjusted the miter gauge at the table saw to match, cutting a rabbet on both ends. Since the tenons have a slight angle to them, cutting the top and bottom shoulders at the table saw would have been a huge pain, so I just finished them off with a handsaw. I marked out my layout line between the shoulders, scribed with the razor blade, and used my chisel to make a notch for the saw blade to track in. Then did the final cleanup with the chisel before test fitting. I'm down to the final piece, but before making the trestle I wanted to get the spacing of the legs just right. So I set them up and took a step back to see how they looked. This is what determined the length of the trestle. To make the trestle, I found a nice piece of cherry with a nice curve in it. I used the curve in the wood as a guide to create the curve in the trestle. I tried to find a balance between the proportions of the piece and the grain in the wood. For the angle cut on the ends, I just picked an arbitrary angle that looked good to my eye and the corresponding arch in the trestle. I found the center point and drove a nail in it, and then using a thin piece of wood I bent it around the nail, creating the arch. To make the top of the arch match the curvature of the bottom, I set my scribes to the thickness I wanted and drew it in following the lower curve. Before cutting the curve, I laid out the half-lap joints to connect them to the stretchers. I set up a dado blade in the table saw to cut them. This was a two-pass operation, so I just carefully lined up the blade with my layout lines and made the cuts. I did the same operation for the stretchers. I did a quick test fit and headed to the bandsaw to cut out the curve. I used the disc sander and spindle sander to clean up the bandsaw marks. There are always a few little divots or misshaped parts of the curve left over from the spindle sander, so I just cleaned them up by hand using a flexible sanding strip. Then a final test fit up before glue and finish. Thank you for making it to the end of the project. If you want to help support this channel, please join me on Patreon so I can continue to build cool projects more often. And of course, subscribe to my channel and hit the bell to be notified when the next video comes out.